The Zags have emerged as a strong contender for West Virginia grad transfer guard Jose Perez, with a visit reportedly in the works. Let's revisit what his role might look like in Spokane next season on today's episode of the Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Happy Monday out there, Zag fans, or Tuesday for those of you who may be listening to a show that came out much later than usual on Monday afternoon. I was out traveling this weekend, so didn't get to this quite on the normal schedule. Apologize to those of you who missed it on the first day, but we got a lot of good stuff to talk about today. Courtney Vandersloot was an all-star yet again. We'll talk about what that means for her and her legacy in the WNBA. Filip Petrusev inked a new deal with the 76ers. We knew that was coming, but it's finally here. What does it mean for him? We're also going to talk about Chris Ledlum, former Harvard forward, Ivy League player who went to Tennessee earlier this offseason, just decommitted from the Vols. What does that mean for him? And could Gonzaga get back in the mix? They were interested in him previously. Before we get to all of that, though, we're going to start today's show with the latest rumors about West Virginia grad transfer guard Jose Perez. A report from Trilly Donovan on Twitter. Those of you who are active on college basketball Twitter have probably seen this name. It is an insider who has reported a lot of things. He was the first person to report that Ryan Nembhard was leaning more towards Gonzaga than Arizona. He also reported the Graham Ike news. So somebody who is very plugged in and connected, not just in the college basketball landscape, but in the Gonzaga landscape as well. He recently reported on Twitter that Gonzaga has emerged as a, quote, strong contender for Jose Perez, and that a visit for Perez to Spokane is in the works. No set date for that visit as of this recording. We have not seen anything confirming specifically that a visit is going to happen and when it is going to happen, although I suspect, as I said before, that typically Trilly has been correct on this stuff in the past, so wouldn't be surprised to see that come down the pipeline. As of right now, Perez does have one official visit scheduled during his kind of portal process here, and that is at Michigan with Juwan Howard's team. We'd reportedly seen that Oregon and Georgia Tech were among the other schools interested in Perez's services, and we also know that West Virginia is hoping to get him back like they did with Kerr Kriisa when Kriisa entered the transfer portal and decided to stay in Morgantown with West Virginia. Kind of not getting the impression that that's very likely with Perez, although you never know. Certainly the staff could keep him on board or convince him to come back. He did not get a chance to play last year. For those of you who kind of are a bit unfamiliar with his story, he's a 6'5", 210-pound guard. We talked about him at least once, perhaps twice. So for everyday listeners, you may have kind of heard the spiel about who Jose Perez is, what he brings to the table, all of that. For those of you who have not heard it, we'll go through it here real quick. Perez has kind of had an interesting and relatively unfortunate college basketball career up to this point. He's extremely talented, and the numbers really bear that out. He began his career at Gardner-Webb, averaged double-digit points per game in 2 seasons there, transferred to Marquette. Things didn't really go well for him at Marquette. He only played 10 games. He only played a few minutes per game. I think he averaged about 3 points while he was there. Transferred again during a coaching change, transferred to Manhattan, was an absolute beast at Manhattan. 19 points per game, 4.5 assists, 3.2 rebounds. This was during the 2021-22 season. The best player in that conference, an absolute stud at Manhattan. Leading into the 2022-23 season, Manhattan somewhat abruptly fired their head coach. And at the time, multiple players chose to enter the transfer portal. And again, this was late, like later than it is at this time last season. Perez entered the transfer portal like many of those other players, ultimately ended up at West Virginia, and then somewhat surprisingly was not granted a waiver to get a chance to play last year for the Mountaineers. It's unusual. The NCAA typically grants waivers in instances where coaches lose their jobs. That's kind of industry standard, really. And it was kind of a surprise to see Perez not get a chance. So he had to sit out all of last year with West Virginia. Of course, the expectation is he's going to come in and play big minutes for this team in the Big 12 this upcoming year. And then Bob Huggins does what Bob Huggins did. And we don't need to get all the way back into that. Most of you are familiar with his recent sequence of events and ongoing story at West Virginia. And so Perez enters the transfer portal again. 3 straight years of losing his head coach. Just an unfortunate situation. And now he's back. He's out there, like we said. Oregon, Georgia Tech, Gonzaga, Michigan seem to be kind of the front runners right now, with a visit slated for next week, July 28th through July 30th for Perez at Michigan, and no official visit scheduled for him at Gonzaga yet, although it does sound like that is coming down the pipeline. The main story on Perez in terms of who he is and what his fit would look like at Gonzaga is fairly simple. We've been talking a lot on this podcast about finding a Malachi Smith replacement. There is no player in the transfer portal who is more of an obvious Malachi Smith archetype than Jose Perez. He fits the bill in a lot of ways. He is 6'5". He is 210 pounds. That's very similar to the size of Malachi Smith. I think Smith was listed at 6'4", 205. So Perez has got a little bit of size on him, but virtually the same type of player. Of course, Malachi Smith was a ball-dominant lead scorer for a low major school at Chattanooga, averaged about 20 per game for them. Jose Perez averaged 19 points per game at a low major school at Manhattan. Really similar production, similar role. We're asked to do similar things. Now, there are some differences. Malachi Smith was a very, very good three-point shooter. He was a good three-point shooter at Wright State. He was a good three-point shooter at Chattanooga. He was an elite three-point shooter at Gonzaga. Jose Perez has never been that. That is not the role that he has really filled, and it's probably not the role that he would be asked to do at Gonzaga. Now, those of you who are eagle-eye listeners, everydayers, shout out to all of you. You probably know where I'm going to go with this. I've talked about this a lot on the show, and I call it the Ryan Woolridge effect. Players come to Gonzaga, take on a smaller role offensively, as in they are not asked to be the focal point the way Malachi Smith was, the way Jose Perez was, the way Ryan Woolridge was, hence the name. And when that happens, their efficiency tends to tick up. It is very common for players to come to Gonzaga, take less shots, but take more efficient shots. They are more open. They are not the focal point of the opposing team's defense, so they're not necessarily getting swarmed and hounded the way Smith was, the way Woolridge was, and the way Perez was. And so we see those three-point percentages tick up. It's named after Ryan Woolridge because he went from being like a 32% three-point shooter for 3 years at North Texas to being a 41% three-point shooter at Gonzaga. It was a sharp, sharp increase. Not everybody does that, but a lot of them do. Rasir Bolton went from 33% at Iowa State to 46% in his first year at Gonzaga. Malachi Smith, like I said, he was great at Chattanooga, but he was a 50% three-point shooter last year for Gonzaga, the best of his career by far. Jose Perez is a career 30.4% three-point shooter. Expecting a 10% increase to 40 is a bit ambitious. Again, that's what Woolridge did, so it's not impossible. But if he became a 34% three-point shooter, 35, just a minor increase, all of a sudden goes from being below average to pretty good, pretty valuable. But the big thing for Jose Perez is, what is he going to bring to this team defensively? That's the big questions that I have right now. There's no doubt in my mind that there is an obvious role for Jose Perez as a sixth man, as a Malachi Smith type. Gonzaga could win back-to-back WCC Sixth Man of the Year awards with Malachi Smith and Jose Perez. I think that's very plausible if Perez were to end up in Spokane. I wouldn't shock me if he competed for a starting role as well, whether that pushes Nolan Hickman to the bench, whether that pushes Steele Venters to the bench. Of course, what this means for Jun Sok-Yo, always the mystery for Gonzaga. If he's playing a bigger role, that pushes Steele Venters to probably playing more minutes at the 2, potentially leaves less minutes for either Perez or Hickman. It's not going to impact Ryan Nembhard's minutes. He's going to play a lot next year because he's really, really good. So it's a little unclear exactly what that role might look like, but Gonzaga is not pursuing Jose Perez to bring him in as the 8th man who's playing 8 to 10 minutes per night. They're bringing him in to play 20 minutes per game, to average 8 to 10 points, to play good defense, and to kind of just fill that valuable third guard role like Malachi Smith did. Perez, among everybody who's available, not just currently, but even who was kind of available throughout this process, in terms of comparing players to Malachi Smith, Perez is the most similar to that kind of player. And if Gonzaga is able to land him, I think that the easiest way to think about, well, what's he going to look like? What's this role going to be? How's he going to fit? Is to just think about what Malachi looked like last year. Again, some differences, not as good of a shooter, a bit more of a passer. Not sure if he's going to be as good of a defender as Malachi Smith was. But the overall type of player that Gonzaga is pursuing fits that bill, fits that Malachi Smith role. Nobody out there that is currently available is better for that role than Jose Perez. If they can find a way to pull this off, it is a really excellent late season addition for Mark Few's squad. Well, Chris Ledlum, speaking of late season additions, somebody's going to get a great player in late July or perhaps even August in Chris Ledlum. He was contacted by Gonzaga way back in March when he entered the transfer portal initially out of Harvard. He then became back on the market. He committed to Tennessee, spent a few months there, decided to re-enter the portal. What does this mean for Gonzaga? Could they get back in the market to try to land the 6'6" high-scoring wing out of the Ivy League? We're going to discuss all of that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel, and you can get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right, folks. Just bet $20 and you will land $200 back in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run of each game. All of this on an app that is safe, it is secure, and it is super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So folks, sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 back in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. And of course, another special shout out to those everyday listeners. Appreciate each and every single one of you. We got some really fun stuff coming up later this week on Locked On Zags. We're going to talk some more Summer League action. We're going to talk to folks who were there in the building in Las Vegas, what they saw from Chet Holmgren, from Julian Strother, from everybody else participating in the Summer League. We got some WCC action to cover as well. All that coming up later this week on Locked On Zags. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment or review on iTunes if you have not done so yet. Once again, it is very much appreciated. All right, folks, we're going to move on. Still talking about the NCAA transfer portal, though, because a big fish just became available once again. We continue to talk about, is it over? Is there not enough players available? What's going on with the transfer portal? And every time we seem to have that conversation, have that thought, somebody big emerges again. At some point, it will die down as we get closer to August and closer to September and school starts and admissions kind of becomes a factor. We're going to see less of this. But for right now, we're still seeing it. It's still happening. And the latest is a big one. Chris Ledlum, 6'6" wing from Brooklyn, New York. Spent the last 4 years at Harvard. He only played 3 years, those of you might remember, during that 2020-21 season, the first COVID year. The Ivy League opted not to play. And so Ledlum did not play in that season. My assumption is that he has 2 years of eligibility remaining despite spending 4 years at Harvard. He is a graduate transfer, so he will be eligible to play right away this next season. And he entered the portal back in late March. I don't even think the NCAA tournament was over yet. And Chris Ledlum was already in the portal. He was getting contacted by all sorts of programs, ultimately ended up committing to Tennessee. And then just a few weeks or a few days ago, we find out he's no longer interested in going to Tennessee. He has removed himself from the school and re-entered the transfer portal. A few pieces of information about Ledlum. He was a kind of a contributor all 3 years that he was at Harvard. He averaged 7.3 points and about 4 boards in 16 minutes per game as a true freshman in that 1920 season. Of course, then he did not play the next season because nobody in the Ivy League played the next season. Came back in the 2021-22 season and blossomed into a star. He only played 13 games, in part because the Ivy League had a limited schedule. I think he dealt with some injuries as well. But in those 13 games, about 17 points per game, 9 rebounds, 1.2 assists, 1.7 steals. We're going to come back to that momentarily. Shot 47.5% on twos and about 31.5% from deep. Comes back for his senior year in the 22-23 season last year and fully blossoms. This is his full breakout. Last year was 13 games. This year, 28 games. He averages 18.8 points per game, 8.5 rebounds, 1.5 assists, 1.8 steals, and 1.1 blocks. The kind of guy you want on your college basketball fantasy team. For those of you who play college fantasy basketball, the true degenerates loving this game out there, Chris Ledlum's the kind of guy you want. He boosted that field goal percentage. He shot 56% on two-pointers last year for Harvard, 29.5% on threes. Not a huge part of his game, although he did take about 5 three-point attempts per game last year. So he takes a lot of them, not the most efficient outside shooter. Perhaps a Ryan Woolridge effect could be in effect here for him if he were to come to Gonzaga. He scored in double figures in all but 2 of his games last year. So I guess that would be, I think, 29 games, 27 games, whatever it was for Ledlum last year. He topped 25 points in 5 of his games last year, and he had 8 double-doubles. He also led the Ivy League in defensive win shares. So we're talking about a guy who is a dynamic scorer, dynamic rebounder, got a lot of steals, got a lot of blocks, was one of the best defenders in the entire conference, and now he's available. So who's interested? Well, we don't know a new list, but we know the schools that were interested in him initially, and boy, howdy, is it a list of some of the most premier programs in college basketball. The finalists last time he was in the portal, outside of Tennessee, of course, were St. John's and Indiana. And quite honestly, I think both those programs are probably near the top of the list again. Indiana lost Tamar Bates to the transfer portal. They lost Jordan Geronimo to the transfer portal. They didn't really add any premier wings. They got some freshmen coming in. They added Khalil Ware out of Oregon. He's a 7-foot center, so he's not really going to play a wing position. I could see Ledlum, if he's still interested in going to join Mike Woodson's team, I could see him being a very logical fit at Indiana. And then there's St. John's. And this is the rumor. Folks will remember that as soon as Ryan Nembhard entered the transfer portal out of Creighton, everybody said, Tommy Lloyd in Arizona did this. They pursued him. They tried to convince him to leave Creighton. They got their guy. He's going to go to Arizona. Of course, we all know that did not happen. But a similar conversation happened as soon as Chris Ledlum re-entered the transfer portal out of Tennessee. The Brooklyn native might be going to St. John's. That's what the people are saying. That's what we're hearing, and it makes sense. Pitino wants those New Yorkers. He wants the kids from that area to come to St. John's, to play in Manhattan, to bring this program back to New York City prominence. And if anybody can do it, it is Pitino. Slick Rick has the ability to do this. He has added 12 players in the transfer portal so far this season. I'm not sure he's got more room for somebody like Chris Ledlum, but you can guarantee that Pitino is making the call. He's making the video chats. He's trying to get him out to campus. And if he can bring him out there and convince him to come home, to play in his home state, to play around friends and family, to play at a premier Big East program with an incredible history that St. John's has, I think that's going to be really hard for him to turn down. What his role might look like, I have no idea. Looking at St. John's new roster kind of makes my brain hurt. It's hard to know where everybody's going to fit, how all the pieces are going to shake out. That's for Pitino and his staff to figure out. But you're not going to turn down a guy who averaged 19 a game in the Ivy League and bring him onto a program that was pretty bad last year in the Big East. You're going to get that guy if you can. Now, again, I don't think Indiana and St. John's are the only schools in the mix here. I think other programs who showed interest in him in the past could still have interest. And the list was incredible. Michigan State was involved, Florida was involved, Xavier was involved, Wake Forest, UCLA, Michigan, Villanova, Virginia, Villanova. I mean, there's just a Vanderbilt. There's a huge list. Pitt, I know, was involved as well. And a lot of those programs are not going to be interested anymore. Florida added a ton of players in the guard wing position. I don't think they're necessarily involved here. Michigan State, I suspect, is probably not super involved anymore either. Wake Forest made multiple additions, but there are some programs here that I think still would have some interest. UCLA strikes me as a school that could probably really use a player like Chris Ledlum on a wing spot for them. Michigan, still very active in the transfer portal. I would not be shocked if Juwan Howard tries to bring Ledlum out to Ann Arbor and to play for that squad next year. I think that there's a chance that Villanova makes some sense. There's a chance that Vanderbilt certainly makes some sense if Jerry Stackhouse can convince him out there. I think West Virginia, who wasn't necessarily connected to him initially, they need some help. They're losing Jose Perez, lose Toussaint, lose Trey Mitchell, lose Mo Wagee. Like they need some help. And if they could convince Ledlum, man, that would be a huge heist for new coach Josh Ehlert and the Mountaineers at West Virginia. In terms of his role at Gonzaga, look, the obvious need here for Gonzaga is more of a guard, and Ledlum's a little bit more of a wing. He's 6'6". He's a really good rebounder. He's kind of more of the Julian Strawther ilk, not a three-point shooter in that range, but not really a guard. But he's such a good defensive player. And I think that's the key. The Zags need more defense. Ryan Nembhard, Steele Venters, Graham Ike, the three big additions for this program, none of them are known for their defensive chops. Meanwhile, the program loses their best defensive player, not named Anton Watson, in Hunter Salas. They lose solid defensive players in Rasir Bolton and Malachi Smith. And they don't replace them with defenders who are as good as those guys. They just didn't. They replace them with very talented players who fill specific roles that are necessary, but they're not great defensive players. Ledlum is. He's big, he's strong, he's physical. Again, nearly 2 steals per game and over a block per game last year as well. That to me is the critical piece of this. Ledlum's fit offensively would be it would be interesting to see how it would work. Again, the mystery here remains Junseok Yeo. If Yo's going to go out and play 25 to 30 minutes per game next year, I'm not sure Ledlum has an obvious role. Let's look at it this way. If you add Chris Ledlum, you have 9 players kind of all fitting into 3 distinct buckets. You have your 3 guards in Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Dusty Stromer. You have your 3 wings in Steele Venters, Chris Ledlum, and Junseok Yeo. And then you have your 3 bigs in Anton Watson, Ben Gregg, Graham Ike. That's 9 players right there. Zags barely play 9. Who out of this group gets bumped? It's probably either Stromer or Yeo. And again, it depends on how confident they are that Yo's ready to contribute big minutes right away. If he is, Stromer's probably on the outs there. But then you have to figure out how does that work? Nembhard, Hickman are your only 2 point guards. You don't feel confident with Venters playing the point, I don't think. So you're kind of in a unique spot. Ledlum doesn't fit as obviously as somebody like Jose Perez or the other players Gonzaga had been pursuing, like Paul Mulcahy, like Joe Toussaint. But Gonzaga needs perimeter defense. They need guys with active hands. They need big physical players who can harass opposing WCC guards and not let teams like Pacific hang 90 on them like they did last year. Chris Ledlum's going to come in and prevent that from happening. He would be one of the key parts of Gonzaga's defense, second only to Anton Watson in my mind as a key part of Gonzaga's defensive attack. And if you don't figure out what to do with him offensively, that's fine. Now, is Ledlum going to want to come into a situation where he's not clear what his offensive role is going to be? Probably not. And that makes the sell a little bit more difficult. If St. John's is promising an opportunity to come home and be the starting small forward and score in double figures, and Gonzaga can't really promise that, that's difficult. If Gonzaga is promising him a starting spot and says, hey, we really value your offense and defensive contributions, maybe. But I'm not sure how that fits all together with who Gonzaga currently has on the roster. So I'm not holding my breath that Gonzaga will be super involved in the Chris Ledlum sweepstakes part 2 here in mid-July, but his talent is undeniable. And in the past, when good players have become available late in the transfer portal, like Paul Mulcahy was, like Toussaint was, like Jose Perez, Gonzaga's reached out. Do not be surprised to see Gonzaga's name connected to Ledlum in the next few weeks, but I'm not holding my breath that he's the obvious fit for Gonzaga. And certainly if Gonzaga does manage to land Perez, I don't think you would see Ledlum in a Bulldogs uniform next season. All right, folks, we're going to close out today's show talking about Courtney Vandersloot's latest All-Star Game appearance and Filip Petrusev officially getting a deal done with the Philadelphia 76ers. All of that coming up right after this. All right, folks, segment 3 here. Still Andy Patton, still locked on Zags. We're switching away from talking about transfer portal targets for Mark Few's team and instead talking about a couple of pro Zags with the latest updates, including Courtney Vandersloot participating in the 2023 WNBA All-Star Game. It was her 5th All-Star Game appearance, also her 3rd straight All-Star Game appearance. She appeared first in 2011. Then there was a long gap, appeared again in 2019, then in 2021, 2022, and now, of course, here in 2023. Not a super productive game for Courtney, not that it matters really at all in the actual All-Star Game. She played 10 minutes, she had 2 points and an assist in the game. She also participated in the Skills Challenge. The WNBA set up the Skills Challenge to be 4 different teams of 2, and they were basically teammates. So the Team Liberty was Courtney Vandersloot and Sabrina Ionescu from, of course, the New York Liberty and an Oregon alum as well. The Kelly Graves team, as they could have potentially named that squad. They did not win. Chelsea Gray and Kelsey Plum from the Las Vegas Aces took the trophy there. Ionescu did win the three-point shootout, though, and she shattered the previous record, which was held by Courtney Vandersloot's wife, Allie Quigley, who, of course, retired after this last season, but is the only four-time three-point shooting champion in either the NBA or WNBA history. Quigley, one of the greatest shooters of all time, and Sabrina went out and absolutely destroyed her record. For the record, Sabrina set what would be the NBA record in a three-point shootout as well. Just a monstrous performance from her in this event. And Courtney's been having a really productive season. Once again, you don't make the All-Star game if you're not playing really productively. And New York's been a little bit more up and down than a lot of people expected. Of course, this is Courtney's first year in New York after spending her entire career previously with the Chicago Sky. She's averaging 11 points, just under 9 assists per game, also 3.7 rebounds and 1.4 steals through 18 games. Really good stuff from Courtney. Excited to see how the rest of the season is going to shake out for her. Closing up the show here, talking about Filip Petrusev. We talked about him twice in the last couple of episodes, so many of you will have heard some comments about Filip Petrusev already. He officially inked his deal with Philadelphia. I say officially because last time we talked about him, the 76ers head coach Nick Nurse had been on Tyrese Maxey's podcast, one of the Philadelphia players, and Nurse basically confirmed Filip is going to be on the roster next year. So we knew this was coming. It was all but confirmed. Now the deal is in place. It is a 50% guaranteed contract for this upcoming season, which is a really good sign that Petrusev is not going to get cut. That was the big fear, is you sign a contract and then before the season starts, you don't make the cut and you get waived and then you're kind of SOL for the upcoming season. Petrusev gets 50% of his contract guaranteed. So even if he does get cut, he's still going to get some money out of it, which is great because getting cut late in the process and not being able to find a deal in Europe is kind of the worst case scenario for players like Petrusev. I think the odds are pretty high that Petrusev will spend a lot of this upcoming season in the G League with the Delaware Blue Cats because Philadelphia is pretty stacked in the front court. I think it's awesome. They signed him. Of course, they drafted him 3 years ago in the 2021 NBA draft, I believe, or 2020 NBA draft. Stashed him overseas for a couple of years. Of course, he left Gonzaga early to go play at Mega BMAX in Serbia, was the MVP of that league, got drafted, spent the next couple of years in Turkey and Russia, and is now trying to make it stick in the NBA for this upcoming season. And he looked really good in summer league, 12.5 points, 4.5 boards, shot about 61% from the field in his handful of appearances with Philadelphia. But again, of course, the 76ers are starting Joel Embiid at center. No mystery there. They also have Paul Reed as a backup. They have Montrezl Harrell as a backup, and they have former Orlando center Mo Bamba as a backup. Petrusev in that mix with all of those guys, that's a lot of bodies. That's a lot of talent. That's a lot of veteran experience in front of Petrusev. Does that mean he can't crack the rotation ahead of those guys? Of course he can. He might. He could. But I think it's more likely he spends a lot of this season in the G League, ends up splitting some time playing partially in the NBA, partially in the G League. Regardless, the minute he steps foot on an NBA floor will be a really good moment for him, of course, and for Gonzaga. Another player making their debut, another player taking a non-traditional route, leaving Gonzaga early to go play in Europe to come back to the NBA. We've never really seen a Zag do that. Of course, Kevin Pangos had a long, fortuitous route to get out of Gonzaga and through many, many teams and many, many heartbreaks and many, many injuries before finally getting an opportunity last year with the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA. Short-lived opportunity, mind you, but at least he got it. And for Petrusev, this is it's a smaller scale of that story, certainly, but it would be very cool to see him get an NBA opportunity and continue to prove that coming to Gonzaga is going to lead you to a professional career, whether it's in NBA or in Europe or both, and maybe in a different order than you might have expected. But really good stuff from Petrusev. Really excited to see him get his opportunity this year with Philadelphia in the NBA. All right, that is going to wrap us up here for today on the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to listen to the show or watch the show. For those of you on YouTube, more fun stuff later this week with Summer League wrapping up, WCC conversations, all sorts of good stuff. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. Thank you all for listening. And as always, go Zags.